Cora Bellweather was 22 years old when the town physician stood before the full assembly of the Cedar Falls Council and declared, in a voice carrying more certainty than the evidence actually warranted, that a batch of cough tincture mixed by her own two hands had killed a child, and she was sent out that same afternoon with nothing but her grandmother's mortar and pestle, a small leather satchel of dried herbs, and a single dose of laudanum sealed in glass. The whole of what the sheriff's men allowed her to carry from a shop the council had already ordered padlocked. She had no family left to shelter her, no doctor willing to speak for her, and no reason to expect that a single soul in Cedar Falls would ever look past the nearest name to find a truer one. But what Dr. Ellison and the council did not know was that a full day's walk east, in an abandoned quarantine station, the county had shuttered years before. The plain, unwelcome truth of what had actually gone into that bottle had been waiting a very long time, sealed inside a tin case for someone patient enough to go and dig it out of the ground. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what happened to Cora Bellweather in the spring, a dead child's grieving town turned against her, you have to understand the trade that raised her, and the patient. Exacting discipline a proper apothecary learns long before she ever learns to trust her own judgment completely. Her grandmother, a woman named Agatha Bellweather, had kept the only apothecary shop in Cedar Falls for 30 years before her death, mixing tinctures and salves and fever powders with a precision she had learned from her own mother back east. And when Cora's parents died of a winter fever within a week of each other, when Cora herself was only 6, Agatha had raised her granddaughter the only way she knew, standing her on a stool beside the mixing counter before she was tall enough to see over it, teaching her, long before she learned her letters, to read the color and smell of a tincture the way another child might learn to read a picture book, and to understand that a measurement taken carelessly could cost a person their life just as surely as any bullet. By the time she was 12, Cora could identify every dried herb in her grandmother's shop by scent alone, blindfolded, and by 17, Agatha trusted her completely with compounding medicines for the town's sickest patients, because her hands, steadier than her grandmother's aging fingers had become, could measure a grain of a dangerous compound with an exactness that left no room for error. Agatha told her once, in the plain, unhurried way she told her most important lessons, that medicine properly understood was simply chemistry practiced with love, that a compound measured in haste could turn a cure into a poison with no visible warning at all, and that the whole of their trade rested on the fact that neither of them had ever once sent a bottle out the door they had not personally measured and trusted. When Agatha died, 2 years before the trouble began, Cora took over the shop entirely on her own, and the town, which had trusted the name on the label for 30 years, saw no reason yet to question whether the granddaughter's hands were as sure as the grandmother's had been. The trouble began, though Cora did not understand it as trouble at the time, in the autumn before the tragedy, when a new commercial supplier from the capital, a smooth and ambitious man named Silas Croft, began undercutting every established apothecary supply house in the territory by a margin steep enough that it should have raised more questions than it did, and Cora, like every other small-town apothecary trying to keep her prices fair for families who could barely afford medicine, began ordering a portion of her raw compounds through Croft's cheaper channel, rather than her grandmother's old, more expensive supplier back east. What Cora could not have known was that Silas Croft had been quietly relabeling a considerably more concentrated and dangerous compound as the milder, standard-strength ingredient Cora believed she was purchasing, a substitution that cost him nothing extra to produce, and that no apothecary anywhere along his supply chain had any reasonable way of detecting. For nearly 2 months, Cora's cough remedies, compounded from what she believed was standard-strength ingredient at her usual careful measure, moved through the town without incident, because most patients receiving them were adults whose larger frames tolerated the hidden extra concentration without visible harm, until a particularly severe fever swept through Cedar Falls in early spring, and a mother, desperate and trusting, gave her own small son a dose measured for an adult, and the child, already weakened by fever, did not survive the night. Dr. Ellison, the town physician, arrived the following morning to examine what remained of the bottle and tested its contents, finding correctly that the tincture was considerably stronger than any standard cough remedy ought to be, though his hurried conclusion, reached under the grieving pressure of a town in shock, named only Cora's own careless measurement as the explanation, since he had no reason yet to suspect that the raw ingredient itself might already have been wrong before it ever reached her mixing counter. Word spread through Cedar Falls within the same day, traveling the way grief and fear always travel together, faster and less carefully than the truth ever can, and the town council, meeting that same evening under pressure from a grieving family demanding accountability, decided without ever examining Croft's supply shipments that an apothecary whose tincture had killed a child could not be permitted to keep practicing in any capacity, and ordered her shop padlocked and her professional standing revoked that same night. Cora, with no family left in Cedar Falls and no standing to argue against a grieving council's decision, was escorted from the only home she had ever known to the edge of town before nightfall, and told, not unkindly but firmly, that she would need to find her own way until the inquiry, whenever it finally came, might clear her name. She packed her grandmother's mortar and pestle, a satchel of dried herbs she had gathered herself and trusted completely, and the single sealed dose of laudanum the sheriff's men had permitted her to keep for her own protection, and she set out, not toward any distant relative, since she had none left to find, but east along the old county road, toward the abandoned quarantine station the county had built during a fever outbreak years before, and shuddered once the danger passed. She walked the better part of a day, reaching the station as the light was failing, a low, weathered wooden building with a sagging porch and boarded windows standing alone at the edge of a dry creek bed. And inside, the air was cold and close and smelled of dust and old carbolic soap, in a way that told her plainly no one had crossed that threshold in years. She built a small fire that first night, and in the morning, restless and unable to simply wait for an inquiry that might never come, she began to set the small room in order. And it was while clearing debris from beneath a collapsed examination table that she noticed one floorboard sat slightly higher than its neighbors, its edges worn in a way that suggested it had been lifted and replaced many times before, the particular kind of small discrepancy her grandmother had spent years training her eye to catch in a mislabeled jar. She worked the board free with the handle of her grandmother's pestle, patient as she had been taught to be with anything worth doing properly, and beneath it, in a shallow cavity lined with oiled canvas, she found a small tin case, and inside it, wrapped against the damp, a bundle of papers, and on top of them a letter. Its ink faded, but its careful hand still legible, addressed to whoever might one day find this place. The letter had been written by a former county health inspector named Dr. Ambrose Kettering, who explained in a hand-grown urgent as it went on that he had been assigned nearly 2 years before to inspect Silas Croft's supply warehouse after a similar unexplained illness in a neighboring county, and had discovered, through careful testing, that Croft was routinely mislabeling a dangerously concentrated compound as its standard strength counterpart, a shortcut that had, by Kettering's own careful count, likely reached at least a dozen small-town apothecaries, who had no way of knowing their trusted supplier had deceived them. Kettering wrote that he had reported his findings plainly to his superiors at the Territorial Health Office, only to learn within the month that his position had been quietly eliminated as an unnecessary expense, and that Croft, it turned out, held a private financial understanding with the very official overseeing territorial health inspections, an arrangement that had buried Kettering's warning before it ever reached anyone with the authority to act on it. He wrote that he had refused a payment offered to simply let the matter drop, and that he had come to this abandoned quarantine station, where he had once served during the fever outbreak years before, and knew every hidden corner of the building, to leave the proof somewhere he trusted, in the hope that some future soul, faced with the same convenient blame he had watched fall on other innocent hands, might carry it further than he had been allowed to. Beneath the letter, Cora found Kettering's original testing notes, describing exactly the mislabeling he had discovered, and beneath those a final folded document, a sworn statement prepared before a notary in the territorial capital, naming both Silas Croft and the health official who had protected him. Statement that had waited in the ground for nearly 2 years because no one investigating a single tragedy in a single small town had ever thought to search for a dismissed inspector's testimony instead. Cora sat a long while in the cold station with the papers spread across her knees, and she understood. With the same steady clarity her grandmother had taught her to bring to any measurement, that she was holding the one proof capable of clearing her name entirely, and of protecting every other apothecary still unknowingly measuring poison into good faith. In the morning, she wrapped the papers carefully back into their oilcloth, tucked the tin case beneath her arm alongside her grandmother's mortar and pestle, and walked toward the territorial capital, where she presented herself, travel-worn but resolute, to the territorial health commissioner's office, to a careful man named Mr. Halloway, who examined Kettering's notes and sworn statement for the better part of 2 days before informing her that findings this precise would very likely reopen not only her own case but every unexplained illness traced to Croft's warehouse across the territory. Word of what the apothecary's granddaughter had carried out of an abandoned quarantine station traveled through the territory within weeks, and the health office summoned Dr. Kettering himself to testify formally and issued a warrant for Silas Croft's arrest on charges of fraud and criminal endangerment. Though Croft, forewarned by the very official who had once protected him, fled the territory before any marshal ever reached his warehouse door, Dr. Ellison and the Cedar Falls Council, faced with sworn territorial findings that named Croft's mislabeled compound, and not Cora's careful measurement, issued her a formal public retraction within the same season, restoring both her professional standing and the shop her grandmother had built. And though Cora returned to Cedar Falls changed by what the winter had cost her, she reopened the apothecary counter with her grandmother's mortar and pestle set once more in its familiar place, and every bottle that left her shop afterward carried, alongside the Bellweather name, her own careful signature as well. Cora Bellweather was 22 years old. In the spring, a grieving town's convenient judgment took her good name down, with a tragedy that was never truly hers. She had walked away from a council too quick to blame the nearest careful hands, carrying nothing but her grandmother's mortar and pestle and a satchel of herbs she trusted completely. And beneath a quarantine station's forgotten floorboard, she had found not gold but the plain, patient, unbreakable proof that a measurement taken with care will always, eventually, outlast the lie built to explain away another man's careless greed. It was the truest cure she ever found. If this story stayed with you, if you sat inside that cold station with Cora while the morning light moved across Dr. Kettering's careful hand, take a moment before you go and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell us, too, about the person in your own life who taught you to trust your own careful hands over a stranger's convenient conclusion. Threndall Stories tells the quiet, unwritten stories of the American frontier, the ones history left out, about the people who were counted out and came back anyway. Subscribe to keep walking this road with us because the next quiet frontier tale is already waiting.